Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. And I have as a very special guest today, Dr. Jenifer Bird. Welcome, Dr. Bird.
Thank you so much, Granny. It is such a treat to be here to chat with you. And I'm giggling because I enjoy your intro. That was fun.
Oh, Art Against Ignorance helped me make that. I used to have just the violin concerto, but I wanted it to segue into something where I could have some of my major talking points, and that's what he did for me. He put the
Nice.
guitar riff at the end and added that.
Yeah, it's nice.
Someone said cannot see Granny. Why is that? I don't
Yeah,
know.
you were actually you were frozen there for a second.
Oh,
So
okay.
they're a couple seconds behind us. So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, my signal is actually quite weak, which is surprised because I'm hardwired in.
I was wondering because there's a delay even as you and I are talking.
Before we begin, I do want to say that today's topic is a bit sensitive. It is definitely not a topic for children. So if you have young children around, you might want to busy them somewhere else. And we may also get into some topics that may be a bit triggering for some people. We will be talking about abuse within the marriage relationship. And so if that is a trigger for you, you might want to consider that as well. Okay, with that, let's begin, Dr. Bird, with your background. What is your educational background and what is your field?
Okay, my educational background. I have a BS in mathematics with an education minor from Virginia Tech, and I have a Master of Divinity actually from Princeton Theological Seminary. That's a 3-year degree. And then I have a PhD in New Testament and Early Christianity from Vanderbilt. So my field is biblical studies. I teach both primary testaments of the Christian Bible in an academic setting. And I teach people to bring critical thinking to their engagement with the Bible. That's my primary gig. And as you know, right now, my focus is on talking about what the relationship we call marriage looks like and actually is in the Christian Bible. So
Yeah, and now Dr. Bird has a new book coming out very soon. Now I've forgotten the title of the book. I'm
that's
sorry.
okay. No, it's fine. Marriage in the Bible. What do the texts say?
Okay. And Dr. Bird was kind enough to give me an advance copy. The book actually does not come out until December 15th. Is that correct?
It's a confusing thing here, Granny. I have to be honest. It was published on Halloween. There were copies on the shelves, and then I got my copy a couple weeks ago, and some people have theirs already, but all the websites say it's not out till December 15th. So I don't know what's going on.
Okay. Okay.
It's coming out soon, one way or the other, right?
Right. Right. Okay. So the publisher got me an advance copy so that I could prepare for the interview. And there's a number of topics in there that I think that are really good and I really want to discuss. I forgot where I was beginning with this, but anyway, in the description, there are some links that are important. There's one to Dr. Bird's website. There is one to the Amazon copy of the book so that you can buy a copy for yourself. And there is one to Dr. Bird's YouTube channel where you can hear Dr. Bird discussing this and other topics as well.
Thank you.
Okay, the first thing, chapter 1 of the book, one of the things you talk about is the mandate that many Christians see to be fruitful and multiply. And I have seen this obviously, everywhere, but it is actually not something that I heard at an early age because even as far back as 1979, Josh McDowell came to the college where I was a freshman. And in talking about Christian dating, one of the things that he said to us was, you don't need to worry about fulfilling this commandment. Be fruitful and multiply. Look, this commandment has already been fulfilled. We don't need to do this.
Yep. And no, I'm impressed that Josh McDowell was actually having such a reasonable approach to that particular line, to be honest.
I know where I was going. I'm sorry for cutting back and forth, but one of the things I wanted to bring up, you are a believer, is that correct? Not really. Okay.
I
Okay.
don't talk openly very often, but since you've asked, I will tell
Mhm.
you that the label if I need to choose a label, I will use humanist.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
I
That
grew
makes
up in
sense.
a Christian home. I went to a Christian seminary, and I identified that way for a very long time. Um, and I hesitate to talk openly because for people who are, and I say that I'm not, it makes it hard for them to hear what I have to. And I really do, Anyway, so I don't mean to interrupt what you're trying to go with that. I just wanted to explain why this is kind of but since you're asking, I'll go ahead and, yeah. So there we are.
Okay. That makes more sense to me. As I was reading the book, I was
Mhm.
thinking that you were a believer,
Mhm.
but that you were a very liberal believer.
Okay, right? Sure.
Um,
I'm trying to be, I like that I have students who say, "I don't know what you think, what you personally believe." That's a good goal, right? To be able
mhm.
to have that I'm trying to represent lots of positions and lots of perspectives, and in particular on this conversation, it's important to me, um, that we all respect each other, even if someone has an idea that I might not agree with. I will want to make sure other people can wrap their head around where that person is coming from. We don't have to agree with them, but do you understand them? And so I'm glad to hear you say that about the book in general, because I'm trying to go for a position that people can maybe have some aren't threatened by, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I got that impression from the book that you were trying to draw all people to kind of a central point, drawing the ultra quiverful type people to a place that's more reasonable, but
Mhm,
also draw the people that have completely rejected it all, like me, to
mhm, mhm.
there's some things in here that are worth gleaning.
Maybe some things worth gleaning, but also just understanding why people get hung up on some of these things that you maybe
Mhm.
have said, this doesn't apply to me anymore. And sometimes, especially the longer you're in that space, the easier it is to be like, "Ah, whatever," instead of understanding why your neighbor is really hung up on Genesis 1:28 or whatever, right? Like,
Mhm, mhm.
yeah,
So go ahead and talk a little bit about that. Why are people hung up on that, and why should they not be?
yeah, okay. Well, it is a passage that, Genesis 1:28, I should probably read it, but, be fruitful, right? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, right? Um, it is a passage that for millennia, the people in faith communities have been turning to say, this is what God commanded and ordained for marriage. Go do that, go reproduce. And so prior to the first century, so prior to anything related to Jesus and Christianity, this was already a thing that rabbis and the teachers were already pointing to and saying Genesis 1:28 and Genesis 2:24, those are defining marriage for us, blah blah blah. So on a really kind of a basic level, tradition speaking, right? People have been taught to see it that way. People have been taught God God commanded this, so go do it. But what I think is really kind of interesting, there are a couple pieces to this whole thing that I think are just basic steps into seeing it differently. One is that, aside from this very important point that you brought up about, we're about to overpopulate ourselves, the planet, right? We have already overpopulated. We need to cut back. Just even setting that aside, most people who want to say, champion 128 don't even know what 129 says. And 129 says that we're all supposed to be vegan, and so I sometimes when I used to laugh about this, and if we would switch our focus, stop taking reproduction so seriously and start eating more plants, we would
Mm,
actually be doing a double whammy on addressing our planetary global warming
mhm,
issues. Anyway, the other thing about this is God tells the animals to be fruitful and multiply. So in verse 22 of the same chapter, so it's not like God is telling them to get married and reproduce and multiply. It's that this is giving word to acknowledging an element of who we are, right? Animals reproduce, and and humans have a desire to reproduce. there's also the backside. One of the things that I point out in the chapter is, no one needed to be told to get busy having sex, right? They didn't need the command, right? And it's interesting because I've actually asked, I've brought this up for people that did the people at that point in time need to be told to get busy having sex and having babies? Like, would we have not would the human race have stopped? Like, no, that wasn't necessary, right? So all of that comes out of, instead of taking this as a command from God, taking this as understanding what it is, which it's a myth. It's a part of an ancient collection of writings. And one of the things about myths is they give voice to things for people. They in particular, in long pre-technological spaces, right? They have stories that explain things, or they have stories that they can pass to explain to their children why there's a rainbow in the sky, or so they have stories to explain why your neighbors across the river speak a different language than you do. Like, why is that? So instead of taking it as a command, it's easier. I think it's a more helpful way for those who want to continue to read the Bible to think of it as something that's just putting to words this thing about humans and human nature. And the other thing is, there's no mention of marriage. Like, people read it as being about marriage, but there's no conversation about marriage. It's just God.
That was something that I had not noticed until, you pointed that out, and when you did, I went back and I checked Genesis 7, where they have all the begats.
Okay.
And there's no mention of any wives or any marriages. It's just that this man had these children. It doesn't say with whom,
right?
Whether it was with
right.
one woman or with many women.
Yep.
The first mention of any wives comes with Noah and the flood. It does mention that Noah was saved with his wife and his sons and their wives. That's the first time they ever mention wives in the Bible.
Well, that's an interesting thing, Granny, too, because depending on the translation, they might actually start in Genesis 3 referring to the two humans as, this is your husband, as like when the woman eats the fruit and then she hands some to her husband who's with her. So and she is referred to as his wife. So in Genesis 3 it does do that. But I still like your point, which is the other point about men begatting, right? Like, it's like it happens miraculously, right? He had children.
No women needed.
No, exactly. It's just gross, and it happens even in the Newer Testament when, in Jesus's genealogies, it's all men. But one of the things that I'm also very invested in this whole conversation, Granny, is to have people consider the fact that in the Hebrew, so even the passage you referred to in chapter 6 and 7, when it talks about Noah and his wife and his son and their wives, in the Hebrew, the word there isn't wife, it's woman.
Okay.
And so, in fact, in both testaments of the Christian Bible, primary testaments, there aren't nouns being used that actually mean husband and wife. It is always just man and woman, and the translation committees make a decision. This time, this word ish, we're going to say that it's man here, but 2 verses later, the same Hebrew word ish, we're going to call him a husband here. And so there's a layer of directing our current ideas of marriage onto these texts, which is part of my frustration, right? With the whole conversation here, is people are reading when you're directed to think of these people as married, even though the story itself doesn't uphold that, right? Then we're also usually carrying all of our own ideas about marriage, whatever those may be, put it onto these people, right? So when it says Noah and his wife, it should say Noah and his woman entered the ark, and his sons and their women.
Okay.
But that makes people uncomfortable, right?
Yeah. Now, the word used for could it have been more than one? When Noah and his woman, is it necessarily a singular word, or could he may have bought 3 or 4 women?
He he might have, technically
Okay.
speaking, he may have had more than one woman, but that would also be indicated in the language. It would be clear if there was
Okay.
more than one. Mhm.
Okay. Do you know for sure whether the word refers to a single, or yeah, you weren't I did not prepare you for this question,
That's
so
okay. That's okay. Um, well, Isha is the the noun that I'm referring to that is woman and that people choose to translate as wife from time to
Mhm.
time in the Hebrew Bible, and it would be plural. There's a plural form of it. So, maybe I don't understand it. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the
I was
question
just
you're asking.
wondering specifically when the Bible refers to Noah and his woman,
Oh,
if the word for woman there is specifically a singular word?
yes.
Okay,
Yes,
it is. Okay.
it is. Yes.
Now, then the first people that are talked about as being actually married, would that be Abraham and Sarah, or is that relationship with Abraham and Sarah even not necessarily referred to as a marriage?
So, one of the things this I feel like it's gonna sound like I'm kind of indirectly answering your question, but, what we see I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind. I'm gonna do this real quick. Um, because Genesis 12 is where we see them, and what happens in the story, um I was trying to find okay, so it's in verse 5. So in verse 4, Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him, blah, blah, blah. He was 75 years old. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot. Every single English translation is going to call her a wife right there, but
Mhm.
the word is woman.
Okay.
And then, and the same if you see husband, it's the word is going to be the noun there is going to be husband, man, but the committee has chosen to call him a husband. And the
Mhm.
same is true for the verbs. I think this was the thing that was most startling for me. There were 2 points for me that were really startling. One was thinking about Genesis 2:24 through this lens, because that's where it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his parents and cling to his wife," right? "And the 2 shall become one flesh." Well, the Hebrew says, "Cling to his woman," and that just kind of blew my mind the first time I thought that through with any seriousness. But the same is true for the verbs. There isn't a verb that matches up with what we mean by marry. So there isn't a verb in the Hebrew Bible for marry. The verbs that are used, primarily 90% of the time, the verb, when you see a verb to marry or some form of marrying, it's actually the verb to take.
Mm.
Because men go and purchase, they go and take a woman from her father, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And then there are a couple other verbs that are used that are even worse than that. They have even worse connotations, in my opinion, in terms of this isn't the take like the wedding vows. Do you take this man and do you take this woman? No, this is like go take this object as
Mhm.
your own.
Go possess it.
Yes. So there isn't there isn't a verb yet in their language to designate this thing that we call marrying.
Mm.
So
Mm.
nobody in the Hebrew Bible is actually being talked about as married in the way that we mean married,
M'kay.
right? Yeah.
M'kay.
The woman is taken, she's a possession, she's primarily there to do the cooking and breeding. I'm not, like we need her for her vagina and her uterus. That's it.
Yeah. Now, when we get to the New Testament, one thing that went through my mind and I was anxious to ask you about
Hmm.
was I've heard a couple of different takes on Mary's pregnancy with Jesus.
Mm,
And the one that I always, kind of went with was I had one pastor that said that in Jesus' day, when a man was betrothed to a woman, that was like a marriage, and that he moved in with her parents, and they acted every bit as much like a married couple. So and then when he had enough money to purchase his own home, then they would have the wedding and they would move into their new home. And so it was not at all
Uh-oh.
unusual for a woman to be pregnant at her wedding because they've been living together for some time. It even wasn't unusual for them to have children. In fact, that was even a sign that God had blessed this union, that they already had children even before the wedding. Is there any truth to that view, or is that completely something that somebody made up?
Um, I think someone may be taking a kernel there and running with it. So, um, you're frozen again, by the way, just so you know. But I'm just gonna. I can hear you fine, but I'm just gonna let you know that that's what's going on. Um,
Okay.
that we do know that, say, in the first century, in the context of Jesus's parents, in the more rural contexts, they didn't have that practice, and it's kind of similar to today. In the more rural parts of the country, things are a little bit more traditional and more conservative, generally speaking, not across the board. And in the cities, things are a little more progressive, right? So in the more populated regions, yes, sometimes a man and a woman would were engaged and would live together for a year before they got married. So that this reference that this pastor made is on a certain level is credible, right? I don't know about the whole. I haven't looked into it, so I can't really speak to the other element that you're talking about in terms of children and whether. Oh, that's much better. Oh, that's
I reloaded my screen.
good, good, good. Yes. Um, yeah. So the idea of already having children before being married, I can't speak to that, to be honest.
Okay.
There could be, but because, if you're not, if you're not fully aware of how to prevent a pregnancy, and you're living together for a year, right? I mean, you could have a child before you got married. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't have
Now,
more than that on that.
was it different by the time you got to the 1st century? Was there more of a what we consider a marriage by that time?
Yes, we have a verb to talk about marrying. Um, and the thing is, obviously, we can see that two people are coming together, forming families, and all that stuff, which is what we might call marrying. And so my concern is really for us to be clear about what is going on in these relationships, what kind of power dynamics are going on here, what's expected of people. All of those things are really important to me. So, sure, people are getting together, but they don't have labels for it in the same way that we do. That means they thought about it differently than we do. That means, they had women were property, right?
Mhm.
And so that's still the case in the first century, right? When we get to the day of Jesus's era and all that stuff, right? Still very, very patriarchal. Women are still property, but there's a verb for marrying that shows up in the Newer Testament in the Greek. But we still don't have a different word to designate between woman and wife or
Mm.
man and husband. We still don't. So so the two primary Christian testaments, I think we should do away with the use of the words husband and wife. Like, I don't think it should show up
Mm.
because I think that would help people think about how different it was then than it has become for the most part, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
There isn't an example of a marriage in the Bible that is entered into by two equals, willingly by each, and based on love.
Mm.
That doesn't exist in the Bible, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I'm a fan of people who get together on those three things. You know what I mean? Like, whether or
Yes.
not they get married, but that they're in that kind of a relationship. So, yeah. So anyway, so yes, things are a little bit different by the first century. Yes.
Okay, this kind of draws us into the second point that I wanted to get to, which skips all the way to chapter 9.
Okay.
And I'm going to bring up something that I highlighted from the book if I can find. Nope, that's not the right tab. Um, there it is. Sure, there we go. And this is what I highlighted. Though he himself had the belief that all things related to sex are oops, nope, that's yeah, we'll go ahead and go with this one. Are sinful. Augustine challenged those who thought that procreating was evil by connecting marriage and procreation, specifically having children, is what redeems having sex. I thought that was a very interesting comment and something I had not heard before. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure, sure. To be honest, Granny, I did not want to deal with Augustine because
Oh,
I really didn't want to. I
okay.
got multiple chapters into the book and I was like, I can't avoid him because the church was so significantly influenced by his beliefs,
Mhm.
and I just needed to unearth it a little bit. It honestly, it was very it was it made me sick to my stomach every time I had to read his stuff. It's really, really awful.
Yeah.
So, very body shaming, sex shaming, so much guilt and shame. So anyway, so yes, so he had his own, I'd say, struggles or issues around sexuality. People say that we might call him today maybe a libertine, like very, very sexually free and active for a time. And I'm not interested in shaming anyone's personal choices around sex and activity, just so you know. Um, but in his culture, in his context, he didn't have a healthy way of processing any of that, and he just dumped a whole bunch of shame on himself, and kind of
Mm.
tried to swing to a very, very a group that basically said that would allow you to have sex when you first join them if you can't kind of keep control of yourself. But the higher you get, the longer you're part of this group, you know, you don't do that anymore. There's no more sex. And so this guy is the one who's defining what sex is supposed to be for all Christians for the next 1500 years. Are you kidding me? Like, so yeah, his writing is full of vitriol and anger and judgment of people. And he's very, very direct about humans would be better if we didn't actually have sex.
Mhm.
Aside from the fact that we would then stop to exist, like cease to
Yeah.
exist, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And sex itself is just sinful. But the
Mhm.
one thing that does redeem this terribly sinful, guilt-inducing act of sex is that it brings about children. So that's why the Catholic Church in particular has such an interesting take on no uh prophylactics, right? And
Yeah.
large families. Like,
Mhm. That's what took my parents out of the church.
is it?
Yes. After having 4 children,
Huh.
they said, "Something has to give. We don't want any more children, and the church tells us that we have to." So, they left the church.
Good for them.
Mhm. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to bring up was this passage, and this one hit really close to home.
Okay.
It says, "It pains me to have to say this, but the way that God is depicted over and over again is as an emotionally and physically abusive husband. Many people have been taught to excuse this element of who God is in Scripture. God's ways are higher than ours, or who are we to question God, or something along those lines. Please do consider that these same people often have a hard time seeing abusive relationships today for what they are."
So you said that hits home for you, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Do you
Oh, yeah.
mind saying more about that?
I had a period I went through in my marriage that I call the dark years.
Mm.
And basically, my husband did not listen when I would tell him what I wanted and didn't want, what I enjoyed and didn't enjoy.
Mm.
And I felt that my position as a Christian woman was to give him whatever he wanted.
Mhm.
And it got to the point where I was so angry and so frustrated that I finally broke down and said, "I can't do this anymore. I cannot pretend that I'm okay with this because I'm
Mm, good for you. I mean, I'm
not." And
sorry. I'm so
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
but
But even then, I never, ever looked at that as being abusive.
mm,
Um,
mhm.
one of the things that really clued me in wasn't until years later when, my younger daughter said to me, "Mom, all through my teenage years, the lights were on, but no one was home." And I thought, I knew that I was being fake. I knew that
Ah,
I was trying to put on a front
I
and let
see.
everyone know that I was the happy Christian woman. I'm happy because I'm in Jesus because that's what we're
Mm,
told to do,
mhm, mhm,
and I did not realize that. Now my daughter, she's a pediatrician. She's very astute, she's
mhm,
very observant.
mhm, mhm,
She's the only one I've ever heard that
mm,
has picked up on this and caught this, but
mm.
it was a very interesting comment.
It is, and I'm so sorry for both of you, right? That
Mhm.
she experienced it that way and knew didn't probably know why, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and that was your
I s
reality that you needed to d you know, you felt you needed to do. Yeah.
I still wonder to this day if she has put all the pieces together of the puzzle
Yeah.
and figured out why. It's possible that she has,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
if she has, she's never said so.
Okay, interesting, interesting. I'm so sorry that that was your reality, and I think, what makes me what has actually led me to PhD work actually was this kind of a thing, that there are passages in the Bible that people take very seriously and that lead to exactly the marriage you were talking about, that you were living, that
First
women
Corinthians 7:4 was the bane of my existence. I
right?
wanted so badly to get rid of that verse.
Yes, I bet you did, and the thing is people don't realize there's a verse in there that says that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Do we wanna read it for or do you want me to open it up and read it for your listeners, or do you wanna
Sure, go
do
ahead.
you know it off the top of your head, or do you
I can paraphrase it, but I can't quote it, but basically it says that a woman's body is not her own, it belongs to her husband, and a man's body is not his own, it belongs to his wife.
Yeah, exactly.
And so do not deny one another
Yes.
except for during a time of prayer. In fact, I did a video on a pastor who took this even to a further extreme. And it's a video I did a couple of years ago on on a sermon that I called the worst sermon
Mm,
ever.
mm,
He gave it on Mother's Day, and I entitled it "Reverse Consent," because
mm,
his
mhm,
point was that not only does a woman not have permission to refuse sex to her husband,
right.
she must ask permission to not have sex. And I
Yeah.
said, "You've gotta be kidding. You mean every 5 minutes she's supposed to say, 'Can we not have sex right now?'" You know, you're walking through the grocery store, it's like, "Could we not have sex right now?"
This would be really inappropriate time. Can we please not right now? Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, we laugh about it, but I
Mhm.
mean, there was a pastor who thought that was a good idea,
Right,
to make
right.
that claim. And here's the thing that just I learned about this when I was in graduate school, which was like 2004, 6-ish, that there were there was a the thing so here's the thing. It's not just that Christians living their lives at home are doing things that are empowered by the words in this book to
Mhm,
treat each other or one more than the other, whatever, in a way that isn't kind and loving. Like, it's not just that, even though that is bad enough, in my opinion. But it's that these people then go take positions such as in the legislature. And,
mm, mhm,
so there's a conversation about that had to take place 15 years in a row. The Democrats brought this bill to the state legislature of the state of Tennessee 15 years in a row,
here's a
which
classic
was
example of what you're talking about. Marjorie Taylor Greene tells
Ooh.
women, "Don't have."
Ah! Yeah,
Yeah,
I I
I
just want to
had
give her a big
prepared
F
that
you.
one, and then I
Mhm.
wasn't even sure if I was gonna bring it up, but since you
Yes.
brought it
But
up, yep, that's exactly what you're talking about.
and this bill was about putting on the record the possibility that a man could rape his wife. Men kept saying, "I can't rape my wife. She's my wife. If I want to have sex, I have sex. Like it's not rape." 15 years in a row.
Mhm.
It was not voted in. So this is the state like people, and that was like the late 90s. So I think it finally passed in the early 2000s. Like this is right. I mean, this is just sorry. I'm upset because it just is upsetting, and it's just you've already made the point, and I'm just trying to
Oh,
reaffirm your
no,
point.
it's
But it's widespread. It's not just behind closed doors, right?
exactly. Do you know who John Piper is?
I do. I mean, I vaguely know who John
Uh-huh.
Piper is. Yes.
He is, the pastor at Bethlehem Baptist in Minneapolis.
Okay.
It's a mega church with several satellite churches. He's written a
Yes.
lot of
Yes.
books. Um, the pastor at the church that I went to practically worshiped John Piper, and as church librarian being in charge of, what books we took in the library,
Ah,
anytime he wrote a book, I immediately went and bought it
right.
because, our
You knew
pastor.
that was
Right.
good stuff. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And he, put out a video that I have broadcast, and signal boosted quite a bit,
Hmm.
where he says, point blank, that if a man is physically abusing his wife, that she should just endure that.
Yeah.
Um, and the way he phrases it is like this. He says, the question was, should a woman remain with a man who is abusive?
Mhm.
And he said, "Well, it depends on what he's doing. I mean, if he's asking her to sin, then no, absolutely, she should not do that. But if he's merely hurting her," and I was like, you've got to be kidding me." And I've brought this up to a number of people who follow him who said, "Oh, John Piper would never say that." And then I show them the video, and
Mhm.
they're
Mhm.
just flabbergasted that, yeah,
Yeah.
that's his position.
Yeah.
He's just hurting her. I mean, what difference does that make?
Right. And here's the thing, Granny. That's what I actually did my dissertation on was the passage in First Peter 3, which backs up that way of thinking, right?
Mhm.
First Peter is talking about people are suffering for being Christians. Oh my gosh, Toto, now I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I've not paid attention to everything you've put on the screen, by the way, because
Well,
I'm trying to stay
this is
focused,
the
but I
first
love that you're
one that
yeah,
yeah, this is
okay.
the first one that really needed to be addressed.
Ooh, I'm so sorry. Oh gosh.
That is awful.
How have you processed that, Toto? Mm. Oh, I'm so sorry. Um, you know, I First Peter 3 is the passage that talks about uh, right before this, it's talking about the slaves enduring being punished for being a good slave because it makes you more Christ-like, and which is just awful in its other way, in all of the other tangential ways. And then chapter 3 starts off talking about, you know, be silently submissive to your man, right? You might win him over with your behavior. In the same way, the women of all I'm having a hard time moving on because I'm so sorry for
For
Toto now.
Toto.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Do we need to say more about that or give that a little more space before moving on? I don't know.
To be honest with you, I'm too overwhelmed to even know what to say.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's a
Um,
lot. Mhm.
but yeah, definitely hugs Toto.
Yeah. I like the way people are responding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, anyway, I don't need to belabor this point, but this is the passage that says, you know, the women of old used to, they did this by, I'm sorry, I feel like I should read it because I'm a little
Go
distracted
ahead.
or tired,
You
but yeah, I can pull
Do
it
you
up real
wanna
quick.
look for that?
Yeah.
Because there's something I
Yeah.
wanna say real quick while you do,
Yes,
and that
please.
is
Great.
There are some really good questions that are coming in, and I'm holding all of the questions for the very end so that we can get through a couple of talking points. So if you have asked a question, I'm not ignoring you, I'm starring you, and we'll get to you at the end.
Awesome.
Okay, you got it?
I do.
Okay.
I'm going to change my translation says wives, and I'm going to say women and
Okay.
and men instead, just so you know. Women in the same way accept the authority of your men, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their women's conduct when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Don't get me started on that. Right? Right?
Right.
Rather, let your adornment be the inner self with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. And this is one of the few times I like to cuss, because it's like I don't have a gentle and quiet spirit, so I'm screwed, which is very precious in God's sight, that gentle and quiet spirit. How many times did you hear that trotted out, right? It was in this way long ago that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their men. Here's the part that got me when I was doing the research for my dissertation. Thus, Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is right. And then my translation is, and are not frightened by terrifying things.
So yeah, I remember that part.
Right. So long story short, this is the passage that pastors turn to tell women to stay in abusive relationships. And Toto, right? And the model of enduring something unpleasant makes you more Christ-like. I mean, that's in here, right? That's in the language of these letters and telling women. And this passage that you said, that your body doesn't belong to you, belongs to your partner. Like, I think they meant well when they were trying to say something about mutuality, even though that's not how people who aren't kind or aren't going to take it. They take it to mean you're my possession, right? I mean, that is what it is literally saying.
Yep. And here's another passage that I highlighted from the book that I wanted to bring up that is exactly along those same lines. Please hold on to each of these points as you reflect on how marriage is talked about in the Bible and the examples being modeled for people of faith. No wonder so many people today have a hard time seeing such language, manipulation, and treatment as abusive, especially when it is followed by claims of everlasting love. If people are finding ways to ignore or excuse this dynamic with their God, not only can it be tolerated in any other part of their lives as well, but that practice, excusing the behavior in the most important being in their lives, numbs them to seeing the extent of the issue in relationships around them.
Thank you for highlighting that, Granny.
Yeah.
You get it.
Okay, one more major talking point we need to get to, and that is homosexuality.
Okay.
And well, actually, before we turn to homosexuality, let's go ahead and take the questions that are on this topic.
Okay.
That's what puzzles me. Oh, actually, this one is on homosexuality. That's what puzzles me about the anti-gay thing. I mean, guys don't get pregnant. There's no need for abortions.
Such a great angle on that. I mean, yeah. Yes. Yes.
Okay. And then, do you think religions believe women are gaining too much power, so they are fighting back by trying to oppress and suppress them? I know my opinion, but let's hear yours
I
first.
was going to say, they asked you. People talk about backlash, right? That's that. I think that happens in cycles as well, right? This forward movement usually has a backlash, right? Go ahead. You want to say something about that? Yeah.
And what you were saying about backlash, my background is in law. And one of the things we talk about is that the law is a pendulum. When something horrific happens, we make a law to make sure that never happens again. But usually that law will have some kind of bad consequence in the other direction. And when the pendulum swings far enough that something horrific happens in the other direction, then we make a law to correct that.
Interesting.
And the hope is that eventually we'll get the pendulum right in the middle.
The hope, right? Because it keeps swinging. I do, I think that there's a connection to the fascism that's growing in various parts of the planet, actually, in political positions, that is also going along with this other issue for women that this person raised, I think, plays out in every part of our world, I think.
I definitely think he's hit the nail on the head. I think there are a lot of pastors out there that see a loss of their power, having to share power and authority with women in the church. I see a lot of men feeling like they're losing their privilege, and they don't want to lose the position of privilege. And yeah, I do think a lot of this backlash has to do with that, wanting to hang on to their power.
Yep. And, it's interesting too, because when I started spending time with feminist theologians, and I started thinking about the whole idea of God and empowerment just radically differently than I had as when being trained by the Christian ideas of God and power. Oh, yeah, we can talk. I mean, it's a whole different game, right? Within a patriarchal mindset, it's power is like pie. There is only a certain amount. In a feminist empowered, like everybody's empowered space, it doesn't work that way. Like everybody, it's just it grows the more people are free to be who they are and bring what they have to give, And so it's always so exhausting. It's like the fear that people are trained from childhood, I guess, right? To think about the world through those lenses. I'll be quiet. I could
Oh,
talk.
no, you are more than welcome. I just thought this was kind of
Yes,
funny. Women
great.
in burqas still get raped. It's the men that are the problem. Instead of women wearing burqas, men should have chastity
Yeah,
belts.
exactly. Nicely said. Hollywood sign is proof of Nephilim. That is true. And even when you see, I don't know if you see it in real life or you see it depicted in, on a screen somewhere where a man, whether it's a brother, an older brother or a father, gets super protective over his daughter or sister or whatever, right? That just tells you what has gone through their head, right? When they get sued, they're afraid for their daughter or this woman that they know and love. They're afraid for them. And like, that's just telling all of us the thoughts that have gone through your mind when you were a teenager or whatever, right? Am I making sense right now, Granny?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I heard a statistic when I was in college that just blew me away, which was that they said a survey was taken and 80% of men said that if they knew for certain that they could get away with it,
Yeah.
they would rape a woman.
Yep.
That blew me away.
Yep.
I don't get that. I do not get that.
Exactly. How does that happen? How do we get that many people, right? That many males who think that, who can actually process that response and sleep at night? How does that happen? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now getting into homosexuality.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Does the Bible in fact forbid homosexuality?
As with every single topic, there will be a passage to back up opposite takes. So there's a passage. There are two passages that I'm sure most of your listeners come from a religious tradition and left it behind, perhaps. But a lot of people know the passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 that say, you shall not lie with a man as you lie with a woman. And one of them says, you need to be stoned to death for it. So that people say is a condemnation of homosexuality. What that actually is a condemnation of two men having sex. So on a very honest, serious level, the Bible doesn't talk about sexuality. It talks about sex acts. Okay. Now we can extrapolate that and just assume that they're talking about a sexual orientation, but they're not. They're never, ever, ever talking about a sexual orientation. So the Bible can't actually address homosexuality. It does talk about sex acts. And yeah, right there, that is a homophobically driven comment about two men having sex. It is. And I don't like it. I don't like it. And I used to accommodate it. And and so now I'm trying to educate people around it. So you could look at that and say, extrapolate from the sex act to it being an assessment or a claim on a person's being. I get how you make that extrapolation. But there are also passages that talk about two men having sex, or that talk about two men being as intimate as two humans can be. So what are you going to do with that? Because just like women in leadership, some passages say no, and then, oh, hello, we've got all these really powerful women in leadership talked about in the same text. So what are you going to do with that? They're both there.
Mm-hmm.
The thing for me, Granny, and I don't know if you wanted to talk about this, but the thing that was hardest for me to process was when I had a credible scholar point out that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is described as the lover to his beloved, who is a male. That the lover-beloved relationship is being put upon Jesus and one of his disciples. That was really hard for me to wrap my head around initially. And I was an ally. It's not like I already was very LGBTQ ally friendly, you know what I mean? But just the idea that this guy, Jesus himself, is depicted in a lover-beloved relationship. Holy mother of God. Like you don't, what else do we need to say? Jesus himself is depicted as having sex with a man. So you tell me, Granny, does the Bible condemn it? It does in here. It does in this place. But for most Christians, the person who matters most is actually depicted in that kind of a relationship. That is stunning.
When I read that in your book, the first thing I did was go and check. Now, I know that in the Gospel of John, Jesus from the cross says, "Woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother." And, and that disciple that Jesus loved from then on took Mary in. And I was wondering, okay, do they use the same terms in the other Gospels? And I checked, and none of the other Gospels have that portion in it.
No.
In fact, there are no men at the cross in any of the other Gospels.
Exactly.
Only the Gospel of John
That's right.
has a man at the
That's right.
cross.
That's
The
right.
others only have women there.
Yep. I mean, it's stunning. And I love that you did that. That was your response, was just to go look into those things. And the book that I learned that from is The Man Jesus Loved, Homoerotic Narratives in the Gospels, or something like that, for any of your listeners or followers who are interested. I talk about that book every now and then when I can, because even as a scholar who I didn't have a reason to be upset by this. It was just so deeply ingrained in me, to think about Jesus this particular way, but to see him holy, and the Gospel of John is trying to appeal, was when it was written, and so still is, but was trying to appeal to a Greek audience, right? And the lover-beloved relationship would give Jesus credibility to have him depicted that way. Whether or not he actually did have sex doesn't matter to me personally. It's the fact that he's being depicted that way for a particular audience. So give him more appeal, right? And I just
Now,
think that's really
that did not cause a problem for me for one reason, and that is I heard that passage preached back when I was still a believer, and the pastor said, "Now, this is not a sexual relationship. This is just a very close friend." Yeah.
Right. And they'll say the same about David and Jonathan, right?
Yep.
And then, right. And that's why also I loved stumbling across this article by Marianne Tolbert on friendships in the ancient world. And I talk about it. I think it comes up just in that chapter, in chapter 10, that friendships in the ancient world pretty much mirror most marriages today, right? The things that people tend to get out of marriages, the comfort, the closeness, all the pieces of, at least in a Western context, a healthy, open, communicative relationship, those were actually, all of that was met by friendships, and friendships were almost across the board between same-sex people. So what you would attribute to a marriage today almost entirely would have come from a same-sex friendship in the first century. So in a sense, it's actually, they're not actually what am I trying to say here? Anyway, I don't want to say that the piece in John's gospel is actually about a friendship, but I do anyway. I think I'm making things muddy here instead of making it better, clearer. But I very very much appreciated that we could. Go ahead. Go ahead.
In the book, you talked about that in describing the relationship between David and Jonathan, they talked about their being soulmates.
Mm-hmm.
That they
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was had each other's soul or they were each other's soul, but, you know, it's as close as the Bible ever comes to talking about soulmates.
Yes, yes, and in John, I think it says that Jonathan's soul was, yeah. What does it? Yeah, I can't remember the language, but it is. It is the
Yeah.
only time. The only time that soulmate language is used is in reference to David, Jonathan's feelings for David, and
Mhm.
then when Jonathan dies, David's comments as he mourns, he says, "His love for me was greater than that of a woman."
Mhm. Mhm. We have a couple of questions.
Like that's what how else do you take that?
Yeah. 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 Well, they think men are better at everything, including love.
There's that. Oh my gosh, I didn't go that angle. That's funny.
We have a
Okay.
few questions on foot washing. What
Uh,
is the
love it.
connotation of Jesus having his feet washed by another man? Could that be thought to be sexual? Now, Jesus actually washed the feet of his
Yes.
disciples,
Yes.
and, yeah, somebody else brought up the foot washing that Mary Magdalene, washed Jesus's feet. Let's see, where is that one? Here it is. Wasn't it Mary Magdalene washing his feet? Isn't a foot washing a euphemism for a blowjob?
Okay, so go ahead. You wanted to say something. Go.
I was gonna say, I have no idea, so go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay. So a couple things. One, and I talk about this in my second book, Permission Granted. There's a confusion about the Marys. So Mary Magdalene is not the Mary who does wash Jesus's feet. So in Luke's gospel, excuse me, in John's gospel, it's Mary, the sister to Martha.
Mhm,
She's the one who washes his feet in John's gospel. In Luke's gospel, it is a woman who most likely is a sex worker who washes his feet in Luke chapter 7. And right after that is where we're introduced to Mary Magdalene. And that is where in the 4th century, a bishop essentially blends all the Marys together, and he comes out with by saying that Mary Magdalene was a sex worker. There's absolutely no textual anything to justify that claim about Mary Magdalene. Regardless, let's get to the point, which is foot washing. Is it a euphemism for a blowjob? And I would suggest it is not, but it is still incredibly sensual and sexual. Like it is
mm,
still very sensual. And I never heard it read that way in church. And I remember the first time I read it that way, a colleague of mine did her dissertation on reading passages about sex workers in the Bible with sex workers to
mm,
see what their experiences would show her. And
mhm,
I love it. And she brought a couple with her to the presentation at a conference. And, their comments were just get past the religious feeling of this scene of Jesus's feet being washed, because they are all sitting around a table and there's men around the table, they're eating, you're reclining, and a woman comes in and uncovers, like pushes the robe up or whatever, and starts crying on his feet and starts wiping his feet with her hair.
mhm.
Like, picture that. This is incredibly sensual. She already had oil on hand. I mean, that's a sign she's a sex worker. Come on. Like all the things. But like
Oh,
this,
really? I did not pick that up.
yeah, yeah. Like who else has a big bottle of lard, alabaster jar of whatever. Like all the things, right? So it's very sensual. I don't think a foot washing is meant to be a euphemism for a blowjob. I
Okay.
also don't think that Jesus was giving all of the men around the table a blowjob. I think he was actually washing their feet. But I also think that that is much more intimate than most people let it be today.
Are you familiar with The Friendly Atheist?
I am in general familiar.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
yes. He's an excellent journalist, and he's really good at picking up stories around the country where people are violating separation of church and state. And one of the
Hmm.
stories he did quite recently was on a basketball coach, I believe it was in Louisiana, that had a foot washing with his basketball team.
Yes. I heard about that.
Mhm.
Made me so angry. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was a public school. And
Oh, wow.
you know, the coach was saying, "Well, I didn't force them to do it, but you asked them to do it. You
Right,
didn't
right.
say this is an optional thing that we're doing after practice. You
Pow
said this is what we're doing." Yeah,
Power
yeah.
dynamics here. Mhm.
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 But I wonder if that made some of the players uncomfortable.
Oh, of course it did.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, even at the just at the level of this isn't my faith. This is what
Mhm.
I do, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
But I had not considered it from a section.
A
I'm
sexual, yeah.
asexual,
Mhm.
so
Okay.
I tend to miss
Okay.
things that might be sexual clues for
Sure.
people.
Oh, of course. I mean, right? I mean, that's how you're wired. Um,
Mm.
yeah, and I wanna be careful. I don't mean to say, that when Jesus was doing that, that it was a sexual thing. I think that when people talk about sexuality, they usually mean one thing, and that's another thing that drives me crazy, of penis and vagina. It's all very hetero focused and all that stuff, whatever. People sticking things in each other, whatever. But, like, touching our body, like, that is sensual, which is on a spectrum of sensual to sexual, like, all the things about touching, I think that's
Mhm.
sensuality, and that has a connection to sexuality in a way. So I wanted to clarify when I said that about Jesus washing over his feet, like, yeah, I didn't mean to say that he's grooming them or something. I just but it is intimate. Um,
Yeah.
Gosh, did we answer the question? I think we did. I
Yeah,
don't.
we did, we did. We are out of time,
Oh, no!
and
Oh,
yeah, we are. This happens almost all the time. So first, anyone in the audience, if you want Dr. Bird back, if you want us to cover some more of the book, or you just want to hear more from her, leave a comment, and if I get 3 or more of them, I will ask Dr. Bird back, for
mm.
another day. And, thank you so much for coming. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
I'm also glad to leave the audience wanting more so that they will buy a copy of your book.
Thank you.
We have only covered maybe 3% of the book, and there really is a lot in it that is well worth reading. And especially if you have relatives that are right wing, strong believers in this biblical marriage idea. It's really written to appeal to a Christian audience and draw them, maybe not all the way to an
Mhm,
idea of an
mhm,
egalitarian marriage
mhm.
relationship, but at least give them some idea that the Bible may not be what they think it is.
Thank you. That was very I appreciate that summary of what I'm trying to do. Thank you for that, Granny. Yeah.
You are most welcome. Next week, my guest will be Sergeant Skeptic.
Hmm.
He is someone that I just met quite recently, and he does some responses specifically to J. Warner Wallace, the alleged cold case detective, as he was a real detective, and he points out some of the errors in how J. Warner Wallace presents his um,
Ah,
his experiences as a cold case detective, so that should be quite interesting as well.
yeah. Cool. Thank you so much for having me on. Honestly, I've had such a good time talking with you, and I love that there are people that show up for your live stream that are having a good time chatting. And thank you so much for such an interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for this book. It really is a very good book. It is refreshingly different.
Thank you.
Live your life.
Mm, nice.